So this is a project that I'm working on with two colleagues, Nick Mizer and Nick LaLone, all of us game scholars or game studies scholars, but from a different disciplinary perspective. And I'll talk about that a little bit. We begin our paper saying that we're interested in TRPG cultures, that we think that there's some value in looking at it from the perspective that of moving past or building on the work that Fine has done. And we nod to Kat Jones's 2012 piece about Fine, where we say, you know, there's a way to do that by paying attention to the networks of RPG player cultures, as well as being reflective about our own position as researchers. And so that's something that we think maybe is important as we move forward, and that can perhaps be in dialogue with digital game studies or game studies more broadly, which has recently begun to see or begun to express an interest in all gameplay and all games. And so that's our intent. And move forward. This slide talks about the work of the paper. That is the paper that we submitted, and really what I'll talk about today. And so we called a midpoint analysis to reflect that we're in the middle of a qualitative study, and this is not findings, but reflection. And we talk about it as grounded theory in order to say we're interested in the substantive description using comparative analysis in a theoretically saturated way to look at these different socio-cultural spaces, and presenting it as metalog to sort of indicate that we acknowledge the constructedness both of this talk and the paper. And in a way, there's a kind of a recursive or meta-communicative thing happening where I'm trying to walk you through this talk, which walks through a paper that talks about our work. And so that's where we're at. And so the place we begin is with some questions about, well, what are these ideas about role-playing that exist? And so you can see an excerpt from a Google Doc where we look at, we're starting to think about, okay, well, we want to work on a project together, and you can see the references are just the three places that each of us sort of came to this project from. My book, Nick Mizer's book about the OSR, that is the old school Renaissance, and how those play groups create imaginary worlds, and Nick LaLone's work on D&D as a kind of platform. And so there's these different perspectives that we're bringing to it. And the question we have is, well, what's going on here? What are the similarities and what are the differences? And you see, it starts with a thesis, an idea that, oh, there's some commonality. And then we realized, I think, well, maybe we're not sure. How are they similar despite their differences? Well, maybe they're different despite their similarities. We're not sure, so we want to explore that at greater length. And so we began to read pretty widely and sort of think about, okay, what are the ways of understanding the social configurations of RPG groups? And so the graphic is a screenshot of a slide from a talk that we gave earlier this year, where we were trying to say, well, okay, here's some of the ways that we can understand scenes. Here's the way that scenes or sociocultural spaces are understood, and they include, as you can see, notion of the McKay's idea of the imaginary entertainment environment, all the way through notions about community of practice, actor networks, social networks, just different ways of understanding, well, what's happening in these spaces, and how those concepts tie into ideas about participatory culture, gamer culture, communities of play, and ways of sort of trying to make sense of what they're seeing. And so to a certain extent, these ideas are informing the questions that we wanted to ask about what's going on in these spaces. And so this slide describes our who we've talked to thus far before pausing to ask ourselves, are we asking the right questions? What questions should we be asking, and what do we learned? Right? What are these informants telling us about the spaces that they inhabit? And those interviews that we did included what we're calling reflexive interviews, where we had a grad student who worked for for my colleague Nicolas LaLone, interview us using the protocol that we devised and sort of saying, okay, here's how do we respond to the questions we're asking other people? And so that notion of reflexive interviewing gives us a sense of our own positionality with respect to the space that we're looking at. So the one thing that we're able to say at this point, and so this graphic, we call it a Latour litany, borrowing from Ian Bogast's object-oriented ontology. He talks about these long lists that Bruno Latour presents as provocations that sort of, or mantras that evoke some kind of uncapsulatable spaces. And so these are some of the keywords or entities that were identified by our informants when we were specifically asking about, scenes and spaces, like what are the groupings there? And they include different actual plays and different communities or different groupings, as well as different categories of play, conventions and online spaces, and other moments of encounter between players. And so the space on the right of the screen is an excerpt from a conversation that Nick Mizer and I had, where we're trying to say, well, what have we found? What have we discovered? And essentially, the graphic on the left then is an attempt to encapsulate what Nick is saying there in that excerpt from our talk. And the idea is, oh, well, we definitely, regardless of all these things that we're hearing, we definitely are hearing people talk about these three kind of big categories: OSR, trad, indie, OSR, old school, Renaissance, traditional play, connected to D&D, the indie scene. That's pretty big. And so if we use the idea of art world or gaming world to describe these ideational commitments to what play is or how it works, and then when you add in the social networks and material practices and other specific ways of being, the socio-cultural, if you like, then maybe that's a scene. Maybe that's a scene is where we're at right now. And the one thing this graphic is also trying to encapsulate is this idea that we are getting what's in the speech balloon, the articulations of play and play experience. And we think that's giving us access to experience with the play group, which is not exactly orthogonal with, it overlaps with going back or going out to people who maybe you've played with, but maybe you haven't, but are the people you talk about play with. And that includes both, talking to people about it, as well as engaging with the texts and other artifacts of play and publication, things like that. And so to a certain extent, there's another kind of recursive element in that, to a certain extent, even this space becomes a scene, game scholarship becomes a scene, and perhaps this is a play group within it. But that's something that we're thinking about as we move forward. Okay, how do we get access to this, right? The distinction between, as well as the overlap of the play group and the role-playing scene / gaming world. So as we move forward, that's a thing that we are interested in doing. And so this last slide is just an attempt to say, okay, here's, as we move forward, the thing that we're trying to do, describe some TRP scenes, outline broadly the gaming world that they come from or draw upon, and do it in a way that we're constantly making sure that we're not just reaffirming or reifying our own situated experience, but is in fact trying to represent differences and changes, right? The fact that we're, white guys of a certain age and younger players with different experiences and different histories of experience are coming in and having different understandings of what it is that they're doing. So that's my, it's not exactly my time, but that's what I have to say. I want to leave a lot of time for questions from the whole panel. So thank you very much.